Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much. I know I have this particular hour when lunch is settling in and you've heard lots of speeches. It's always bad to be at the end of a session, so I will try and be very succinct before you go for your coffee. You've heard a lot today. I've listened, I've learned a lot to a diverse range of speakers talking about the refugee crisis in Europe, or as us in the drafting committee said, maybe it's not a crisis, maybe refugees shouldn't be put next to the word crisis. They're human beings with rights and dignity. So I'm going to take you just for a minute back to September 2015, but not to the refugee crisis. I'm going to take you back to New York City, where myself, Liza, and Antonia from UNICEF live, and some of our UNFPA colleagues, to the UN General Assembly, where a historic agreement was being made, the Sustainable Development Goals. And unlike their predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs are really based on the principle of shared responsibility. That came across from the beginning. When we had the Open Working Groups document, it came across very strongly when we had the consultations with civil society, that was unlike the predecessor, the MDGs, which was basically a UN-style goal orientation. And you've heard today from the German Interior Minister, from the Executive Director of WCC, and in fact most of the speakers up here, of a call for shared responsibility to address this crisis. Indeed, most of you have underscored that it cannot be addressed without this shared responsibility. But what does that really mean? Does it call for lesser government responsibility? Does it call for more formal legal responsibilities on the part of non-governmental organizations? What kind of accountability mechanisms are we looking at? And are we all prepared to be formally accountable for our actions in ways that we previously may not have been? What then does it break down from institutional responsibility and accountability to individual and community responsibility and accountability? In the era of the SDGs, which is just 3 months old, this is still being worked out. And we at the UN have many, or beginning to have many meetings about how human development, human rights, and humanitarian assistance will work out in the era of the SDGs. And indeed, as many of you may know, there's a World Humanitarian Summit coming up this May. I think Europe is right on the front line of what this shared responsibility could mean. The refugee crisis, and I'll use the word crisis loosely here, has put this into practice and not theory. And we've seen that while lots has been done, while much has been coordinated, there is a lack of coordination. There's been a lack of standard operating procedures. There's been a lack of definition of clear roles and responsibilities. There's a lack of accountability mechanisms that work across countries. There's a lack of having common responsibilities and common practices. And there's a lack of long-term planning. These are urgently required. And it will be interesting and hopefully encouraging to see how faith-based organizations can contribute to this. We need, as Liza has mentioned, a lot more research on how we can work together and document good practices among all our organizations. And it's not just about the UN or even governments showing non-governmental organizations what we have to do. We in the UN are doing a lot, as you've heard from both us and UNFPA and others. We're doing a lot of capacity development with civil society organizations, with governments, etc. We do have a particular mandate and particular expertise in many of these things. But the Ebola crisis taught us, or should have taught us something, that this is a two-way street. We have as much to learn from non-governmental organizations and faith-based organizations as we have to share. It became very clear to us that our institutionalized and bureaucratic response to the Ebola crisis was not working, and it was only in several of the affected countries when faith-based organizations entered in and were able to mobilize their communities that the crisis began to recede. We need to learn from that experience about the power of faith-based organization and see how we can integrate that more deeply into our work. And it will mean that we work much more closely with our NGO partners at the global and local level to address these crises across the spectrum. The short-term response is necessary, and this is what this conference, I think, has been focusing on, what we do right now in Europe, what we can do to collaborate. You've had many presentations about what governments are doing now and the opportunities or options and challenges that they face. But you've heard less about the longer-term response, because the short-term response is necessary but not sufficient. And the longer-term collaboration is absolutely critical. This is a crisis, or there's either flows that are not going to recede soon. They may not come in the years to come from the Syrian crisis. They may not even come from Afghanistan or Iraq, but they will come. Migratory flows will persist and potentially intensify, because it's not just conflict that will drive them. We are looking at massive inequality in the world. There were stories today in today's Guardian that 62 billionaires hold half of the world's wealth. If only 62 people hold half of our entire wealth, then we realize, and we have seen at the country level, how inequality is proliferating and how that is becoming the driver of people on the move. We are seeing climate change as a real driver, again, in the future of people on the move. We are seeing democratic transition and resource scarcity of people on the move. Let's look at climate change for a moment, because we just, as a world, signed a climate agreement in December 21 in Paris. Currently, there are over 500 million children at a high risk from flooding, and over 160 million children at a high risk from drought. These numbers will only double if climate change is not seriously addressed in the next 10 to 15 years. Investing in children will be critical to addressing any refugee and migrant issues in the future. It's not only about helping them reach their potential, as we are bound to do under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but it's also now the best way to ward off the hopelessness, the anger, the despair that fuels the conflict and the violence that contributes to refugee and migrant flows. And in that sense, as our friend over there from Denmark said, we cannot cut ODA in the way that some of the European nations are doing this without reflecting on the longer-term consequences, because we have seen what short-sightedness in international development has led to. We have to come together over this. WCC and the UN are examples of how we can come together. Our histories have a strong focus on refugees and migrants. I was reading WCC's history, and very much after the war, there was a mandate from the Council, the International Missionary Council, to focus on refugees, migrants, and other people who were displaced. UNICEF itself was born purely. We would not exist if there hadn't been this crisis in Europe 70 years ago. So it's interesting that we're at this same point. The two organizations are at the same point, the UN and us, we're at the same point again. For you, almost 80 years later. For us, 70 years later. New challenges can bring fresh and innovative approaches. And our hope today is that what will emerge from these 2 days together is the beginnings of a new and stronger and more committed and coordinated partnership between our organizations and others. The final word before I leave on shared responsibility. Much has been talked about this concept, about shared responsibilities to drive national or subnational goals within countries. A lot of talk is about multi-stakeholder platforms or counter-joint and shared accountability mechanisms within countries. But less has been talked about shared responsibility among countries. This should occur not only in times of crisis, but also to fight cross-border inequities. Our failure to accelerate international development and to accept international injustices and inequities unpalatable in our own countries has left us open. Our best defense in the future, to uphold the values that many people spoke of in Europe, of democracy, of human rights, of openness, of equity, is to invest in the rights of others. For only then will we be able to make our world sustainable and place our faith into action. Thank you very much.